My guest today is Elif Shafak. Elif is a writer, novelist, academic, political activist. She has written speeches that have gone viral on the internet and books that are some of the most widely read books, particularly in her home country of Turkey, although she's actually based in Britain. And is an international, sort of a citizen of the world, I suppose it's fair to say, although that's a funny phrase in this country right now. You put politics together with your writing and always have. I mean, do you do that because you want to change the way people think?
Well, thank you. I've always thought if you happen to be a storyteller from a wounded democracy, from a wobbly country such as Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, Venezuela, the Philippines. I mean, the list is so long and it's getting longer. But if you happen to be a novelist from these countries, I don't think you have the luxury of being non-political, apolitical. You can't just say, you know, I'm only going to write my stories and close the door. Also, I am a feminist, and one of the many wonderful things that the feminist movements of past generations taught us was that politics is not only about political parties, it's not only about politicians or the parliament, it's beyond that. Wherever there's power relations, there is politics. The personal is also political. So if you define politics in such a broad way, again, you can't be non-political. There are political questions in my work. I like to ask questions. What I don't like is when a writer tries to give the answers or try to teach or preach. I don't like that at all. But I think it's a writer's job to ask the difficult questions.
Were you made a feminist by your early upbringing?
I think my early upbringing had a huge impact because I was raised by a single mother, a divorcee, a working mother. At the time, it was quite unusual. I'm talking about late 1970s, early 1980s Turkey. I was raised by two women, in fact, my mother and my grandmother, and they were very, very different personalities. My mom is very westernized, very modern, secularist, well-educated. My grandma is almost the exact opposite, definitely less educated, irrational in some ways, you might say, superstitious, more spiritual, more religious, more Eastern, and yet the solidarity between these two women, even though they were very different, there was such solidarity between them. And thanks to that solidarity, my mom's life improved, my life improved, and I'm hoping, you know, my children's lives as well. So I never forget that solidarity, the support. And I'm a big believer in sisterhood among women who come from different backgrounds.
I mean, those two identities you just described are the story of Turkey.
That is exactly right.
How did you choose your tribe?
I don't believe in tribes. I don't like tribes, and I think an artist needs to refuse to belong in a collectivistic identity or a tribe. And this is a lonely position, but I think it is the best position for art and for the artist, for the writer. I've always felt since my childhood a bit like an outsider, insider, even in my own motherland. So I'm familiar with that feeling, always on the edge of the society, close enough to understand it and to feel emotionally attached and connected, but also maybe in your mind a little bit distant enough to see things from a critical perspective. That is a lonely position, but I really think it is the right position for a writer.
Why do you live in London?
In some ways, I know these are not favorable words anymore. I keep a list of all the words that have fallen out of grace in the last decade, including words such as multiculturalism, diversity. I know people underestimate these words in the world we're living in right now, but they matter to me. I come from a country that has lost its diversity, that has lost its cosmopolitan heritage, and I do know that by losing that, we have lost a lot in Turkey. And even something in our conscience was gone. There's a void there. So I'm a big supporter of cosmopolitan encounters.
That's what drew you to live here.
This is one of the reasons. I think it's a truly diverse society. And unlike many other places, there is much more interaction here among people who come from different backgrounds. So it's not like everybody in their own boxes. Things need to improve, of course, but there is a beautiful treasure of diversity that I'm not sure everybody appreciates. On the other hand, the fact that as a writer, I felt free, the freedom of speech that I found here. As a woman, the equality, relative equality, of course, again, there are lots of things to improve. All these things matter to me. And maybe I should add that I do write in English as well as in Turkish. So to be able to breathe this language, to inhale this language, it mattered to me. So mostly because of the city itself, but also the language, the culture, and the intellectual heritage that I found here drew me to this country.
So how have you felt watching the divisions and the tribalism and the identity politics and the hatred, really, take seed in this country over the Brexit debate over the last few years?
You know, that makes me really, really sad because when I look back, it's been 10 years now since I moved here. And throughout those 10 years, I have seen a big change, a social, cultural, and political change. I used to think when I first moved here, British people are very calm when they talk about politics. I no longer think that way. I mean, before referendum and during the referendum, things changed dramatically, not to mention, of course, the mess that we're in right now. It changed people. It divided families, friendships, it affected. But what worries me mostly is this emergence of tribalism, how political demagogues, just like they do elsewhere in other countries, try to sell us this illusion that we will be safer if we're surrounded by sameness. That's a lie, that's an illusion, but that's basically what they're trying to sell us. But also it worries me when I see and hear things that resonate, that bring to mind an imperial nostalgia, you know, talking about these golden days. People talk about British exceptionalism, but there's nothing exceptional about this kind of imperial nostalgia that I hear from some leading Brexiteers. That kind of rhetoric actually is happening elsewhere, mostly along the fringes of Europe. It's happening in Hungary, it's happening in Poland, even in places like Croatia, in Austria. So we have to understand how tribalism can become toxic, how it's a catalyst, it leads to other things. And I think we need to remember what we have left behind. Memory is a responsibility. We can't behave as if the past does not matter. We do know, we have had enough experience as human beings to know that when nationalism, tribalism, isolationism takes hold, that leads to a very dangerous place.
Do you think multiculturalism led to tribalism and identity politics?
Here's what I think. I make a distinction. I am very critical of the inequalities that globalization triggered. And I think it was a shame that not many people understood this well enough and early enough. Yes, globalization did bring lots of positive things, but also it affected many people in many areas in a very negative way. And that economic inequality, but also emotional factors are important. Anxieties. People, rightly so, have lots of anxieties. I think in many ways. This is the age of anger. It is the age of anxiety, resentment, bitterness. And many people, rightly, fear that their children or grandchildren are going to have a much harder life than they themselves had. So there is a part of me that respects that, understands that, and I'm very critical of echo chambers. I'm very critical of, tribes. We have to understand people who do not necessarily think like us, talk like us, or vote like us. That's something else. But I am also very critical of the demagogues who have been leading another movement of their own for their own political interests. That's something else.
It's a funny word, demagogue, in Britain. I think we would. A lot of people think, well, that there's no such thing as a demagogue in British politics. I mean, okay, maybe Erdogan or Viktor Orban or maybe Trump even is a demagogue. But we don't have them in Britain. Do we have demagogues in Britain?
That is not true. We do have demagogues. It's not necessarily, I mean, we don't need to name names, but I think we live in an age, and this is happening all around the world, in which the power of rhetoric is so important. Facts can be sacrificed for rhetoric. People say, I mean, throughout the referendum campaign, we've seen a lot of that as well. Emotions can be stoked. Fear can be stoked. Just to give you one example, I never forget that huge sign, 70 millions of Turks are coming. Turkey is going to join the EU. Turks are coming, so it's time for us to leave. Everyone knew that that was a lie. Turkey was not going to join the EU anytime soon. It is not joining the EU. Even if that day comes one day in the, in some distant future, that kind of movement can be regulated. but they still put that sign out there because it speaks to people's emotions. So when I say political demagoguery, I'm referring to a particular rhetoric that is based on emotions, that manipulates people's emotions. And there's a lot of that going on at the moment in the world we're living in.
How did you feel as a Turkish?
I felt sad, as if, Turks are these barbaric tribes at the gates of Europe. Also, I felt sad because as someone who's always supported Turkey's democracy, EU membership, because I thought it would be good for our democracy, but also good for the continent in the long run, I have experienced a different kind of tribalism back in Turkey. And if I may put it this way, when we isolate countries, the only people who benefit from that are the isolationists themselves. Yeah, so the tribalists, the ultranationalists, and the religious fundamentalists in Turkey never wanted Turkey to be part of Europe anyhow. When I was growing up, it was a different country. Back then, we always thought we were part of Europe, except Europeans were not aware of this. But one day, we would all come to an understanding. Now it's a different country. Now people are growing up. Young generations are being told that actually democracy is not necessarily it doesn't necessarily suit us, our national needs. It's a Western concept. Maybe we should go and join the Shanghai Pact. We can look elsewhere. So that kind of rhetoric is very dangerous, that kind of isolationist rhetoric, especially for a country like Turkey. And that makes me sad. So I have been observing the damaging effects of tribalism in very different countries, and I think they're all connected.
So you're squeezed on both sides, aren't you? I mean, Turkey is moving in a direction that alarms you, and Britain is rejecting people from foreign lands.
I think Britain is, of course, there isn't one
not
single...
Britain as a whole, but there is a movement
in
Britain, and Britain feels like a less welcoming place. Even for those of us who were born here.
Than it used to be. I understand, absolutely. And we need to be very careful about that. When I look at myself, I've always been very critical of identity politics, singular identities and belonging in one single category. I think as human beings, our minds and our hearts are inclined to go beyond that, to transcend those categories. So when I look at myself, I am an Istanbulite. Of course, I'm very attached to Istanbul, but I'm also a Londoner. And I do believe that I can be two things at the same time. I am attached to the Balkans, the Aegean, the Mediterranean. There are elements in my soul that I bring from the Middle East. I'm a European by birth, and the values that I share and I uphold, and I became a British citizen over the years. So, on top of that, I would like to believe that I am a global soul. Why not? Can I not be a world citizen? Why do we have to reduce ourselves, narrow ourselves down into one category when in fact we can have, and we do have, multiple belongings?
So you can be a citizen of the world?
Yes, I know it's not a positive word at the moment, but
well, it's a very strange thing, isn't it?
I
mean, Theresa May particularly attacked that idea of if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere.
Actually, I so disagree. If you are a citizen of the world, it doesn't mean that you don't care about anywhere. Sometimes your attachments are even stronger because you're not guided by any kind of nationalistic fervor or any jingoistic rhetoric. It's a different kind of attachment, emotional attachment. You can love two cities, multiple cultures, multiple belongings at the same time. That kind of patriotism, without being nationalistic, is an interesting conceptual difference that nowadays, of course, people like Macron are talking about. But I've always thought patriotism is too important to leave to nationalists. Faith is too important a concept to leave to the religious. I think these are areas where the liberals left need to rethink more actively. I think faith and patriotism are concepts that we haven't really thought about for a long time.
What role does faith play in your life?
What I'm more interested in is the dance between faith and doubt. I think faith is important, but faith without doubt is a dogma, and dogmas are quite dangerous. What puts me off is this need for certainty that I observe among lots of people who are very religious. They want to be very sure of the ground beneath their feet, and they want to get rid of doubt. And when I talk to people who are very sure of their atheism, they want to get rid of faith. Whereas what intrigues me is the dance between these two. Can they talk to each other, faith and doubt? Can they accompany each other? Can they be companions? So I guess in that sense, I'm closer to agnostics, people who are not that sure, you know, who see life as a journey, as an open-ended journey. I don't like certainties. To me, asking questions and having open-ended journeys matters much more. What I do not like is collectivistic religions, because I think at the end of the day, they're all based openly or secretly on this assumption that there's an us and there's a them, and that us is closer to the truth or closer to God than them. So that kind of dualistic framework doesn't work for me.
I mean, we're sort of dancing around Islam, aren't we? I mean, in that doubt exists very obviously in Anglican Christianity and Hinduism and Judaism, and the place where doubt doesn't really exist is Islam.
Actually, I do disagree, and I'll try to explain why I disagree, because I think, first of all, I do agree that today, unfortunately, an orthodoxy dominates the mainstream of Islamic religion. However, historically, and even today, when you look at the periphery, heterodoxy always existed. And actually, when you walk around Istanbul, you will come across some Sufi cemeteries. And I'm not trying to romanticize Sufis either, because there might be some Sufis who can be just as hierarchical, just as patriarchal as the mainstream itself. But there's something in the ancient philosophy of heterodox mysticism in Islam that was quite critical, actually, of the orthodoxy. And because of these people throughout the centuries have been silenced, persecuted. When you read people like Rumi, Shams of Tabriz, or Ibn Arabi, there's a reason why their voices have been suppressed, silenced, censored today by the orthodoxy that we're both critical of. So there is an element of doubt. Actually, we have these Bektashi poems in Turkey and across the Middle East, similar narratives as well, questioning the imagery of a transcendental patriarchal God that the orthodoxy created, questioning with humor. That culture is still there, that philosophy is still there, but of course it has been suppressed to a large extent.
I mean, isn't that actually the tragedy of what's going on in Turkey at the moment? That Turkey truly was the bridge between Asia and Europe.
It could have been.
And could have been
It
so
could have
much
been.
more of a bridge today at a time where it is needed more than ever.
Yeah.
And yet it isn't.
And what a shame that is, because as you so rightly said, it could have been that bridge. Turkey had never a proper democracy, but it wasn't as bad as this. I mean, we've been going backwards. And in that regard, I think Turkey does hold important lessons for progressive-minded people everywhere, because it shows us a few important lessons. One, obviously, that history is not necessarily linear. You know, we tend to think that the future is going to be more developed than today. That is not necessarily the case. Secondly, it shows us that generations can make exactly the same mistakes as their great-grandparents had made, as if the nation is drawing circles. But I think it also shows us...
Just explain that bit, because I'd like to explore that a bit. What do you mean?
Well, these are countries that... in our past, there are so many dark chapters that we can't talk about. Turkey is, even though it has an old, rich history, it's a society of amnesia. You know, we have collective amnesia. That's what we're suffering from. That is why in Turkey it's very difficult to talk about the Armenian genocide. The moment you utter the word, you're labeled as a betrayer. It's very difficult to talk about lots of dark chapters in our history. And yet we must, in order to grow up, in order to face, in order to say, you know, I share the pain, I understand, and hopefully those mistakes, you know, those horrible things will never happen again. Hopefully the future will be better. But in order to say that, we have to have a memory. We have to have a responsibility. So we don't properly learn from history in Turkey. Instead, there's a void. And that void is filled with ultra-nationalistic, very bombastic, religious rhetoric about our great Ottoman ancestors, what a great empire we were. This is the popular culture in Turkey at the moment, and of course it's very much backed by the political elite. And we see similar things happening in Hungary, even in Austria. I see the same nostalgia.
Well, that's
in
what I was
different
going to ask you
degrees.
about. I mean, a lot of people are concerned that Europe is not.
Yeah.
People are incredulous that it is possible for Europe not to have the mistakes of history as the first thing it thinks of when it wakes up in the morning.
Yeah.
When we all wake up in the morning, and yet, do you think we are at risk of making the same mistake?
Well, it's quite interesting. There are several academic studies that have been conducted recently. I just want to share one of them, which was done by a Harvard professor, Yasha Munk. To me, it's very important because he asked this question, how vital it is for you to live in a democracy, to citizens on both sides of the Atlantic. And what he found out was the importance of age. People above a certain age, people who either had the memory of the Second World War or the aftermath, they, over 70% of them, of that group, said it is incredibly vital for me, it is essential for me to live in a democracy. Under the age of 30, that percentage drops to 25. Only 25% of the millennials said it was very crucial for them to live in a democracy. So memory is important because when you have the memory of the days of war or the aftermath, when you know what jingoism, ultranationalism, tribalism led, then you appreciate democracy more. I'm not saying democracy is a bed of roses. There are lots of problems, but it is the best political system we as human beings could come up with. We need to improve it, liberal, pluralistic democracy, but to abandon democracy will end up in a catastrophe. My worry is, and this is also happening in the Middle East for different reasons, I hear lots of people, even people who have been educated in the Western world, saying, and I wrote about this in one of my novels, The Three Daughters of Eve, people saying, democracy doesn't suit us. Maybe what we need is a Singapore model. We need a strong leader working with technocrats and good economy, but democracy is not a priority anymore. Human rights is not a priority. Freedom of speech is not a priority. When things come to that point, I think the world will be a much darker place.
Yes, because you do hear people now saying democracy is not such a great thing, even in this country. Talking about people who are too stupid to vote, don't know what they're doing.
Voting is so important. It is so important. We can't brush it aside. But again, coming back to Turkey, I think one important lesson that Turkey has given us is the difference between democracy and majoritarianism. You can have a ballot box. You can have relatively free elections, regular elections, but still that's not enough to render a system a democracy. If there's no rule of law, separation of powers, if there's no free and diverse media, independent academia, if there's no women's rights, LGBT rights, minority rights, without all these components, if you only have the ballot box, or if you only or mostly rely on the election results, that system is not a democracy, it's a majoritarianism. And once majoritarianism settles in, from there into authoritarianism, it's a very short slide, it's a very short step.
How do you go about telling a story in your novels? What's the process for you?
I start with small questions. Like a child, I think we should never lose that curiosity. Why was it like that? What really happened? Most of my stories come to me through images. It's like photographs. I chase those visual moments. But also maybe because I have this academic background, I take my research very seriously. Whether it's a historical novel or a contemporary novel, I read everything I can find on that subject. I immerse myself fully. And then there comes a moment when you stop reading and then you can fly, then you can dream. But for me to be able to dream my story fully and freely, I need to know my subject. And for that, I do a lot of research.
How did you become a storyteller?
I was an only child. I thought my life was terribly boring. And because I moved around a lot, my life was very nomadic in a way. I felt very, very lonely. And so I know it sounds a bit like a cliche, but books really were my friends, and books saved me. They gave me a sense of center that I otherwise lacked. And every time I moved into Storyland, I felt more free. To me, it was much more real. If I may share this with you, in my grandmother's house, it was full of superstitions, evil eye beads, coffee cup readings, melting lead. There was a lot of magic in that house. And yet this was a time when outside the window, outside the house in Turkey, bombs were exploding, there were political marches, human rights violations. And I remember as a child, as a teenager, sitting by that window and thinking about this outside world with its political chaos, and my grandmother's world inside the house with its magic and maybe irrationality. And maybe there's a part of me that wants to weave the political and the magical in my stories. I want to bridge those two worlds.
When did you first write something you were proud of?
I started actually writing at an early age, but that's not because I wanted to become a novelist. I didn't know such a thing was possible, you know. It was like an almost need, like an animal instinct. I tried to keep diaries, journals, but because I thought my days were very boring, I thought there was nothing to write. So I started making up things about people who didn't exist and things that hadn't happened. So for me, it was a very short step from keeping diaries into writing short stories. And then once I started writing novels at an early age, I love that huge canvas that the novel can give you, where you can discuss ideas, where emotions and thoughts can mingle, the heart and the mind can work together. So I love the novel as a genre very much. But if I may add this, I think writing in English was also a big turning point for me, and it wasn't easy because I did not grow up bilingual. And when I look at my own children, I see the difference. They're always making fun of my mispronunciation, the words. My son is still trying to teach me how to say squirrel, which I can't, I find it so hard. So I'm very much aware, like every foreigner or latecomer, I'm very much aware that there's a gap between my mind and my tongue, and the mind runs faster and the tongue is trying to catch up. That gap can be a bit intimidating, but I also think it's very inspiring, it's stimulating, Over time, I realized I love writing in English. It gives me maybe a sense of freedom, and I feel maybe more intellectually attached, whereas to the Turkish language, I feel more emotionally attached, and I need both. If there is melancholy, sadness, sorrow in my writing, I find it easier to express it in Turkish, and humor, satire, irony is much easier in English. I mean, we don't even have the word irony in Turkish, so imagine, all these cultural differences, I find them fascinating.
What do you think the role is of the novel in an era of the internet and box set videos?
People were so worried. You will remember, how ebooks were going to take over. And actually, because we were living in a very fast-moving society, the age of fast food and fast information, there would be no place for novels. And that prediction wasn't actualized. It didn't happen that way. It might someday, but not so fast. And I think there's a reason, because the faster we run, the bigger our need to slow down and just to sit down and go within. And stories provide that, Stories connect us with people beyond our own limited existence, and there's a big value to that. If I may give you an example, I have many readers back in Turkey who are actually quite xenophobic. If you ask their opinions about Armenians, Kurds, Jews, Greeks, the main minorities in Turkey, they will tell you lots of negative things that they've just heard from people around them. But then they come and they say, I've read your novel and I love this character. I cried when that character was hurt. And the character they're talking about is Armenian or Jewish or Greek. Equally, I have lots of homophobic readers, because this is a very homophobic land. My motherland is. And then they come, they say, this is the character that I loved most. And maybe that personality is gay or bisexual or transsexual. So I thought about this a lot. How is it possible that people who are much more intolerant, biased, dogmatic in the public space, when they are reading a novel alone, they become a little bit, just relatively more ready to understand the story of the other, you know? And I don't think it's a coincidence, because all authoritarian regimes, all collectivistic ideologies, they need synchronized energy of the masses, people chanting together, people moving together. You need to erase individuality in order for fascism to flourish, or in order for any totalitarian ideology to flourish. What the novel does is to restore that kind of individuality, but not a selfish individuality. It's the kind of individuality that connects you with the rest of humanity by reminding you that the other is in fact your brother, that the other is your sister, that the other is me, you know, it's no different than me. So for me, that's very important. And I think at the end of the day, racism, sexism, nationalism, they all try to dehumanize the other. And stories try to rehumanize those people who have been dehumanized. So at this age, in the age we're living in right now, I think storytelling has to be political. But I'm not talking about partisan politics. I'm not talking about party politics. Just core shared values, democracy, human rights, equality. On these issues, we have to be vocal, in my opinion, as writers.
Do you remember the books that first moved you as a young reader?
I remember them actually very vividly for different reasons. Some of them because I fell in love with their style, language, some others because of the stories. And my reading lists are very eclectic. I like to read from East and West. I read on mysticism, but I also read political philosophy. I read fiction and nonfiction. I'm a curious reader. You know, it's as simple as that. I do not believe in this artificial distinction between so-called highbrow literature, whatever that means. As long as it speaks to us, our hearts or our minds, we will read it. You know, whatever. I don't care about the genre or the category. I just want to connect, and I want the act of reading to be continuous. I think every writer needs to be a good reader and stay as a curious reader all their lives.
So how do we get people to read? I'm speaking to you as a father now.
Yeah, I hear you.
Of
yeah.
teenage
Yeah.
children who resist reading serious books.
Yeah.
So how do you introduce literature to young people?
Of course, you know, it's also a challenge for me as a mother of young children, but I think it has to start with us, because if children observe their own parents reading at home, then you don't have to say anything. The problem is we often say something, but we don't do it ourselves because we don't have time. But if they see us reading on the tube, you know, going from somewhere to another, sharing stories, and oral stories matter as well. I never underestimate oral culture. That is incredibly important. In the Middle East, in Ireland, I listen to women, and my God, how rich is that heritage, that culture. So there are many ways of sharing stories. But I think if we make it a vital part of our daily lives, children, you don't need to say anything further. They observe it and they take it in as much as they want to, because pushing and insisting is not going to help. On the other hand, I find it very important to have libraries, to support libraries, you know, to make books accessible to children from very different backgrounds, including disadvantaged backgrounds, because at the end of the day, if you cannot afford books, no matter how much we talk about literacy, it's not going to get us anywhere. So it's another thing that breaks our hearts to see how local councils and at a national level as well, the money, the budget put aside for libraries is dwindling, is just shrinking.
Do you think movies and television are a good influence on reading or not? I mean, are they an easy alternative, or are they an introduction to storytelling?
I'm not, like, unlike many of my colleagues, I'm not completely against TV, and actually I think there can be an interesting collaboration between cinema and literature. We have seen prime examples of that. But of course, it is mostly the video games that worry me, because the way they affect our brains is very different. You know, how mechanical things become, how repetitive things become, and once you're fixated, there are interesting studies that show us the impact of such games, particularly on the minds of young people, evolving brains. So that's the thing that worries me.
And what is the role of the mass media now in a country that is deeply divided, where there's lots of political anger, lots of hatred, and actually where the main function of the media is to air the division and expose it, rather than try to bring people together, because the mass media doesn't see its role as trying to heal anything. How do we change course?
It's quite interesting to see this duality being repeated again and again, real people versus the elite. I think we need to stop there and question who exactly is the real elite. I'm very critical of elitism. However, I also don't buy this duality that's being repeated over and over again. And I find it very dangerous, this romanticization of the Volk, of the people, which was one of the core elements of nationalism in 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. The romanticization of the real people goes hand in hand with the denigration of the intellect. We are looking down upon the word intellectual in this country. Nobody wants to be called an intellectual. It's the worst thing you can say about someone, because immediately we think it's arrogance. Intellect matters, I'm not talking about elitism, but to put thought into a subject, to talk about it publicly, these are things that are important. So much more important than that, I think I have a lot of respect for journalists, for proper journalists who are trying to do their jobs. Journalism became the most dangerous profession in many parts of the world. There was a survey in Turkey 2 years ago. They asked people, in your opinion, what are the 3 most dangerous professions in Turkey at the moment? People said the police forces, the military, and the third job they mentioned was journalism. I mean, the fact that journalism is mentioned alongside police and the army tells us something. But it's not only in Turkey, as we're seeing in Brazil right now, in Venezuela, in the Philippines, in Russia, obviously. So in an age in which the truth is being eroded, people can easily use words like alternative facts. It's constantly blurred. And most dangerously, we are being bombarded by misinformation. And after a while, people don't know what to believe in anymore. Those are very dangerous thresholds. And I think we need journalism, we need proper journalism more than ever before. If journalism, if the media diversity and independence collapses, as we have seen in Turkey, the collapse of democracy is imminent, because this is so vital for democracy to breathe. We need the media. We can be angry at journalists, we all are at some point in our lives, but I have a lot of respect for the profession itself.
If writing for you should be political, what is the goal?
I think the goal is to ask questions. As writers, we are certainly interested in words, language, stories, but equally, I believe we are interested in silences. I know I am. When I say silences, the things that we cannot talk about, the taboos in a society, this could be a political taboo, it could be a sexual taboo, but asking questions about issues that we can't debate openly, just saying, why is it like that, And having an open space in your stories, in your books, where you can hear a multiplicity of voices and then leave the answers to the reader. It's up to the reader to make up their own mind, to come up with their own solutions or their own paths. That is something that the writer should never try to, manipulate or teach or preach. That's where I make a distinction. So questions to me are very important, asking difficult questions about difficult issues and having open spaces in my novels where I can discuss these issues. And to be honest, when I look at my work, I realize I've always been interested in giving more voice to people who have less voice. I've always been interested in bringing minorities to the center, the periphery to the center. To me, this matters. People whose stories have been forgotten, erased. There's a part of me that wants to say to my readers, remember the stories that we have forgotten. Or at the end of the day, I think all literature is a mental exercise to put yourself in the shoes of another person. I never forget, I was a high school student. One day I read a novel by Ivo Andrić, The Bridge Over the Drina. And to me, it was eye-opening in many ways, because as a Turk, at school, I had swallowed this ultranationalistic education, and I always thought that we were a great empire with a great military, etc. And then here was Ivo Andrić telling me, have you ever thought about the story of the empire from the eyes of two peasants who lived in the Balkans? How did they experience that story? And then he has these two characters. One of them is very critical. The other one is also underlining the positive sides of the empire, but they're having a dialogue. And that dialogue was eye-opening to me, because you realize there is no such thing as history as an absolute truth, but in fact there are many stories that we've never heard about.
How do you think you can apply that sort of teaching of empathy
Yes.
to our current lives? When you think about where Britain is right now.
Yeah. I think it's so crucial to teach empathy to ourselves and to younger generations, and it has to be done through stories. Because when you hear someone else's story, when you realize how multiple their stories are, it is much more difficult to generalize the other. Then I cannot make sweeping generalizations about women or men, about whites or blacks. You know, it becomes harder because I know individual stories. So it's incredibly important to bring not only one story, but a huge multiplicity of stories. And also, as human beings, we are emotional creatures. We need to accept this fact, and we connect through stories. If I know someone else's sorrow, pain, what they've gone through, there's a part of me that understands it better. If I only read about categories or numbers, then I stop feeling. It's very interesting to me when I look at the writings of people who have survived the worst atrocities in human history, including the Holocaust, genocide, civil wars. Almost all of them are saying almost the same thing. They say that the opposite of goodness, kindness, is not necessarily evil or badness. You know, they're saying these atrocities happened not necessarily because people were evil. They say the opposite of goodness is numbness, is the moment when we stop feeling indifference, when we are desensitized. You know, there comes a threshold when we stop caring. Whether it's 5,000 refugees, 500,000 refugees, numbers don't mean anything after a while if I don't know their stories. That threshold is something that I find very dangerous, because once we have that kind of desensitized numbness, once we stop caring for the other, then anything can happen from that moment onwards. So I think it's the job of storytellers to punch holes in that wall of numbness and hopefully help people to feel empathy for the other.
If people haven't read your books, where should they start?
That's difficult for me, because when I look at my books, each and every one of them is very, very different. And I think I changed. By the time I started writing them, I was a different person. When I finished, I feel like something in me has shifted. But I guess I might advise, if I may, to start with either The Three Daughters of Eve, which is the latest, or The 40 Rules of Love, which is a bit more mystical, The Bastard of Istanbul, which has a little bit more anger and higher energy, or The Architect's Apprentice, which is a historical novel.
I ask all my guests what they think that their most controversial or difficult to achieve way of changing the world might be. Do you have one?
I think I like small steps, and I find small steps important. I don't belittle them. And I think we live in an age in which all of us need to become activists for human rights, for freedom of speech, for democracy. We need to become more active citizens. And there's a lot we can do, actually. That energy that comes from civil society, not top down, but the other way around. I like that. I believe in that. We need to keep an eye on the internet. It was such a big mistake, that kind of extreme optimism of early 2000s, when people thought, thanks to technology, we were all going to become one big global democracy. Now we know better the dark side of technology. We need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of the dangers of misinformation. Right? We need to be aware of the dangers of numbness, and we all need to be more engaged citizens. We have to become engaged, either at local, regional, or national level, care about core issues. We don't have to be partisan, not at all, but be engaged politically in our civil societies, in our communities, and to speak up louder. And I honestly think we need more feminine energy. We need more women speaking up in the public space, and the diversity of women, and more minorities speaking up in the public space.
Thank you very much indeed.